Okay, well, in reality, we've got a ridiculous amount to talk about still, but I'm just going to do my best to sort of breeze through some of this and somewhat labor through Jameson a little bit here, and I can give you a good condensed version of it because I feel like that's probably going to be just as good. Take a look at page 1734 to start with. This has the famous opening phrase of Jameson. He's most known for this line. And here we go. This is from The Political Unconscious, the book in 1983. So again, I reminded you that, like, Jameson's star really rises as, like, saying, well, all these theories are great, but they've lost the political, like, horizon. And for him, that political horizon is Marx. And it is these collective questions. What are we doing here in a bigger picture? Like, you can deconstruct all you want, but why? Why do that? Is there any project for the aesthetic in the context of the social that matters anymore? And deconstruction cannot answer that for you. But maybe Marx can, or maybe Marx plus Adorno plus whoever you want to add, and you get to Frederick Jameson. And he opens this book, Political Unconscious, with the following phrase: always historicize. This slogan, the one absolute, and we may even say trans-historical imperative of all dialectical thought, will unsurprisingly turn out to be the moral of the political unconscious as well. As the traditional dialectic teaches us, the historicizing operation can follow two distinct paths, which only ultimately meet in the same place: the path of the object and the path of the subject. The historical origins of things themselves, and that more intangible historicity of the concepts and categories by which we attempt to understand those things. In the area of culture, which is the field of this book, we are confronted with a choice between the study of the nature of the objective structures of a given cultural text, the historicity of its forms and content, historical movement, emergence of its possibilities, and so on, and something rather different, which would instead would foreground the interpretive categories or codes through which we read and receive the text in question. And you guys, we're going to talk about this second. Although, to be honest, when you said, you can do the objective and the subjective, didn't you say that? The path of the object and the path of the subject, as he said. I thought he was going to talk about, the experience of characters, or the experience of the readers, or so on and so forth, like subjectivity that we recognize. But he kind of, I think, makes it a little bit more confusing than it has to be. Okay, that phrase, always historicized, has become iconic in literary study, and it seems to suggest the idea that historicism will become the thing that everyone should be doing. Okay, and the historicist method. It does not say that, and it's important to understand the difference between what we'll call historicizing and historicism. Historicizing is Jameson's thing, and I'm going to show you a map of how it might work. But it's sort of like big picture. It's like mapping out periods and genres and history and the form of the novel. Somewhat what we were already doing with this, that would be called historicizing, the novel. Where did it emerge? How did it emerge in modernity and capitalism, in desire, feminism, and so on? Exactly what we do in this class, more or less. Historicism would be something you're all familiar with. Maybe Pierre Starbest is an example, although I will push back even on that. He's smarter than that. And I don't mean to denigrate this. That's not what I mean at all. But historicism is when you're looking, again, it's like at 1960s text only. 1960s Canada, and just saying, this text has a relationship to that moment. The phrase might be indexical. This text indexes the Canadian 1960s. And that's what you are getting out of it. Or it could be anything that it indexes, like health systems, or it indexes social, any particular thing of social justice that you're reading it for. Or it indexes basically any one reductive object you're looking at. And to the degree that all of those are interchangeable, I think we're getting into the same problem we just talked about before the break. That we've lost essentially the social totality or social relations that these historical things as well as textual things are embedded in. Okay, so there's a very clear difference between historicizing and historicism. I'll give you one last example. I think I told this to the last time I taught this course, but it has traumatized me. Indeed. And so I once went to this talk. I'm going to this conference next week called the Modernist Studies Association. I used to go to this conference all the time, and then I kind of stopped going because modernism, sadly, it should be the field that gets out of historicism to some extent, because it can be so much more than that. It can be all over the place, aesthetically, like I want to say politically, theoretically, and so on. But a lot of modernism, just like everyone else's field, whether it's Canadian studies, Victorianism, Romanticism, or Renaissance, you'll feel familiar that historicism is what we all do now. It took over the English departments as another response to theory. You know, the real heyday of it was like 2000 to, I would say, about 5 years ago or something like that, 2000, 2015. And then we had this other thing called the method wars. And what at least the method wars were doing, and we'll see some glimpse of it, like Rita Felsky, but anybody writing in the last 10 years is familiar with the reopening of the debate around methodology. Well, one of the reasons why it came back is because we all got sick of historicism. But here's my example. So I went to this modernist conference. This was about 10 years ago. And a guy gave a paper on T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. In The Wasteland, there's a scene, it's kind of in the middle, where this character who has no name, but he's called the young man carbuncular. He's like 24 years old or something like that. And he like seduces a secretary and sleeps with the secretary. And you get all this sort of language of them like having sex, but it's really like quoting or like all these Greek classics as the sound they're making. So they're making like, I forget who he's actually quoting and so on. It's all these weird, and also Renaissance texts that he's quoting. So it's really funny and hilarious.
The scene in The Wasteland. Is it The Wasteland?
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
Yeah. Young man carbuncular sleeps with the secretary, and then she's like, well, now that's done and over, or something like that. And she's like, she moves her hand like a gramophone, and gramophones always had a hand, remember? Like with the needle on it. So it's like, Eliot is super rich and clever and doing all this thing, okay? So you can get a lot out of this scene if you want. But what did I see for 20 minutes was a guy who gave a paper on carbuncles. Okay?
Oh my God.
Carbuncles are essentially like boils and zits. And he's like, let me show you all the imagery of carbuncularness. in like, you know, that poem is 1921 or 1923, I forget, one of the, and he's like, carbunculars in like the 1920s. This is a phenomenon. Here's all the medical language and all the like textual information about what a carbuncular person is. And Eliot has, you know, obviously, you know, understood all of the sort of medical humanities impact of the carbuncle on this character. And I just was exposed to like 20 minutes of like pustules. and I was like so sad because it's like, do I need to know any of this to like enjoy this poem? Like, I do need to know what a carbuncle is. Okay, fine, that's fair enough. But like, beyond that, I feel like I'm totally wasting my time. So I think this rings familiar that you might have, and I don't want to blame, I use historicism all the time. So I'm not calling anyone out in this room or anyone in my field or anyone and this poor graduate, he was like postgraduate student and so on. Like, I don't want to call anyone out on this, but we all use historicism, and I use it, but we also recognize that it can be so minute that, like, why am I pinpointing that one phenomenon as if that's the best thing I can say about it? It sounds like new research. It was. I never heard that paper before. But did I need to hear it? And, like, that's sometimes I think historicism faces that. How far down the rabbit hole of any particular historical data point do we need to know? Because we have lost everything else. But what is the X thing that you've lost? Is it social reality according to Marx? Is it the aesthetic according to the aesthetic? Is it style? You name it, whatever. Okay, historicizing is not that. And Jameson will not give you like that, you know, he doesn't sit and write pages on, like, let me historically situate, you know, Robinson Crusoe, not just in the novel, but 1732. This is what happened on this battlefield in England, and that's exactly what he's referring to. Jameson does not do that. Jameson does, again, what we're going to call historicizing. This is kind of what it looks like. Jameson loves the idea of big periods. Realism, modernism, and then, of course, famously, postmodernism. So, historicism is, first of all, periodization. Okay, but it's not just like that's it and we're done. You know, 19th, whatever, 20 to well, let's probably use dates now, like 1900 to 1950, okay. And video contemporary. But Jameson, like, this starts to look like the English requirement, right? Like, we have British literature, modernism, which is British American if you want, and postmodernism, and so on and so forth. But like, he's not into that either. The reason he's periodizing is so you can start to do what he calls cognitive mapping, and put any particular novel or poem into the schema of the story of modernity, which is the story of, again, the aesthetic and of the literary experience as such. So I'm going to tell you, realism theorizes art as mirror. Oops, mirror. And modernism is no longer sure. And I'm going to say, art as utopian experiment. Okay? It's not a mirror. It's trying to imagine experiment. Experiment. I'm going to go with that. I always forget how that's
Nietzsche's back again. Experiment.
Yeah. Is that not how we say it?
No. I'm just teasing you. You're good.
It's in my notes somewhere.
No. It's fine.
Okay, and then postmodernism is going to be okay, utopian experiments failed. And I'll just put utopia failed. And commodity returns. Art as commodity. But in a way that we're going to call parody. It parodies that. It doesn't really believe that's a good thing. So, parody. This will come back. I mean, that's art as commodity. I'll put it as a question mark. Okay, it plays with the idea. And his famous example is Andy Warhol. What is it? The soup cans. It's mirroring the soup cans, but not because it believes in any utopian end to that. Just because it's this is what. Hey, guess what? Art and the market are the same thing now, folks. All commodities are art. All art is commodities. That's collapsed, but it's because this is no longer important. You're stuck with just things as they are. Although, then you could push back, by the way, and Warhol would say, well, actually, that is utopian, because that means we're all artists, and so on, but I don't know. Depends how Warholian you are. So, I'm going to actually put utopia failed question mark, if you will. It's in my notes. Okay, this is we'll call this bourgeois capitalism. This whole picture, you might call it that too. This we're going to call mass capitalism. We can call Fordism, if you want. And this we're going to call globalized capitalism. Also, it's sometimes called late capitalism. Why is it called late? Well, because if you really are, if you're a hardcore Marxist, Marx thought that as capitalism continues, it runs into its own contradictions, and then it will fall apart. And inevitably, communism will just appear out of that because the contradictions will be too overwhelming. People are tired of buying and selling their labor, and that's the contradiction. They'll be tired of alienation. They'll be worn out, and they will just spontaneously overthrow that. Okay, but the degree that didn't happen, it's really late. Things are ongoing, and the revolution should have happened already, and somehow it didn't. And why? And so that's one time. Sometimes it's called late capitalism. I want to, by the way, just one more thing. I remember teaching this class. Well, I've had students from communist countries. Maybe I don't want to pick on it.
I'm not trying to defend.
Yeah, no. You can raise any insight. All insights are welcome. I've had students from communist and ex-communist countries, in class when I've talked about some of these ideas, and they would instantly say, "I went through that, and it was no aesthetic, liberation thing whatsoever. It was the opposite." So how do you reconcile communism with the sort of aesthetic, like crushing kind of experience that communism seems to have delivered to everybody. And communism got, especially a certain kind of communism, got stuck here with what they would call socialist realism. And famously, Lukács is really obsessed about this. The idea that communism should show the revolution in the content. Like if you see people, like stories of workers overthrowing capital, and there's a lot of realist texts show you that, famously like Émile Zola, then that would be the point of communism, right? That's the only art that is valid, is the overthrowing of that, or also just like the sort of praise of the worker, or it could be like pastoral imagery. I was just looking at this image of like in China there was a meeting with I'm already forgetting. Is it called the president? China's leaders?
You can say president or
President.
Secretary General.
Secretary General. Okay, yeah, and Secretary of State of the United States. But anyways, in the background, what sometimes you see like workers or like iconography of China. This was a very pastoral, like green scene, but it's symbolic of what I think would be an idea that this is the aesthetic that shows us, after capitalism. So, okay, so these are sort of sidelines, but to get to what I wanted to say, have I lost my train? Where did I start on this? Oh, wow.
God stopped in socialist realism.
Socialist realism, yeah. I don't know where I go.
About the workers?
Yeah.
The crushing.
I don't know. All right, never mind. I give up where I was. I've lost completely my train of thought. Okay. Well, anyways, I'm sure we'll come back. But we're doing we're historicizing. We're always historicizing. Okay. So. Okay. Now, what Jameson will call period style, or I don't know. He's not the only one to call it, but he's helpful in this model. Sort of connects with what I was saying just a second ago. Is that we're going to get a picture of all of this together, sort of coalescing in like a form and a genre and a style. Again, for this, it'll still be realism, but I feel more specifically, you could say like, depend. I don't know. I want to say like a temporality of a Dickens novel. It's sort of like from youth to maturity. I mean, it's very much Bildungsroman. But it's almost always from like countryside to city, like country to the city, youth to maturity, like naivete to like moral wisdom or something like that. These all become period style things. Like if you want to go backwards, you can go to Romanticism and talk about cult of the imagination as period style. Or celebration of the poetic as such, the powers of the poem. Powers of the poem, powers of the poet. This is very Shelley. So on and so forth. But every period has a period style. Okay, so modernism, modernism is the period style, but you could say maybe fragmentation. You could say like new long forms. Like again, the Joycean novel, or like the long poem in like Ezra Pound or something like that. Collage is a famous one in visual art, especially Picasso. These are all period styles of the moment. And here, the one that's going to be we'll read is he'll say pastiche, which is related to parody. He calls it blank parody. That's when you're just basically cutting and pasting everything, and because you have no direction anymore. And all forms are equally relevant because they're all sort of circulating in the capitalist marketplace of forms. Just like theory is the same problem. By the way, he's going to say that theory is the postmodern moment too. So like that's one of the period styles of. I think 50 is probably not the right date. Let's push it up a little bit. Like let's say 70s. You got mid-century. What is that? Like 50 to 70. It's sort of after modernism, but not full postmodernism. Okay, and by the way, I think everyone's pretty sure that we're not in postmodernism anymore. Let's say, I'll say like 2010 to now is something else, the contemporary, and it's because digital media, ecology, have shown us kind of an entirely new world. But these two have their period styles. The period style of digital media is like swiping, you know? Of ecology is what? Is it intersubjectivity? Yes. With plants and animals and trees and rivers. It's other things too, but anyways. Okay. I want to point out that this is not something that Jameson did, but people in the last 15, 20 years, especially with eco people, have done this. And to say like there's a period like energy thing. So this was dominated by coal, this was dominated by oil, and this is sort of like peak oil or after oil. And these feed into styles and feed into social relations and feed into economic relations, what energies these are running on. You see this in that text by Deepesh Chakrabarty, before Climate of History, 4 Theses, where he has this famous line, probably won't even get to it today, where he just says like all of the like bourgeois freedoms were built on fossil fuels. And to the degree that they were, what happens now when fossil fuels run out? Do freedoms run out? But it's true that they were, you know, to the degree that mobility, property maybe, or like the rise of the consumer choice. These are all bourgeois freedoms. The state, even the state form itself, these have all risen through energies. And what happens when these energies run out is the biggest question. Does the state form fall apart? Do we get global communism? Do we get anarchy? Do we get nihilism? Do we get zombies? As the theme of all post-apocalyptic, movies will show you. Nobody knows, what this. Or do we get windmills and solar? That's what I want to say. Solar punk, and so on. You can, theory-wise, you can put like Hegel, Marx here. You can put whoever you want here, like Benjamin or Freud. I'm not even going to write them out. Or what else did I put in here? Saussure, Wittgenstein, if you like him. You can add other, like I've not added women, but I should, like some of the war. I don't know. Doesn't matter. But here you might say, Derrida, Butler, and so on. Okay, just giving you a little sense of how these work. I want to add, though, that you can also do this politically in terms of like global political structures. We might call this the area of colonialism. Certainly, colonialism doesn't go away, right, into the modernist moment. That's partly what the two world wars are about. But in fact, it's a question. But even I think it was Lenin who wrote that this is the age of sort of what's sometimes called second stage capitalism is imperialism. Okay, but I don't know. And then this would be, well, we're not exactly post-colonial, are we? Maybe we are. I don't know. Or decolonization. Decolonization is more this, I would say. But at the same time, we're also accelerating globalism too. And that absolutely is the case here. And it was not like this was all absent from here. There was globalization in the 1800s, but it's become the period style, the period economic, the period, I want to call it like, worldview, Weltanschauung, that kind of sensibility. These are all, this is what historicizing means for Jameson. And then he'll just sort of tell stories with these maps in mind, and talk about the rise of the novel or a poem or a particular poem with this in mind. And that's why he's so compelling. And it is actually, ironically, an antidote to narrow historicism. Always historicize is actually against historicism to some degree, except for this is what he means by historicizing, using history. This is the story of history that is going to tell us also the story of style and so on. Okay, so let's actually look at some examples in the postmodernism essay. Okay, 758. Kind of probably going faster than I would like, but I will read here. The concept of postmodernism is not widely accepted or even understood today. Some of the resistance to it may come from the unfamiliarity of the works it covers, which can be found in all the arts, the poetry of John Ashbery, for instance, but also the much simpler talk poetry that came out of talk poetry from the 60s, the reaction against modern architecture, and in particular against the monumental buildings of the international style, the pop buildings, decorated sheds celebrated by Robert Venturi and his manifesto learning from Las Vegas, Andy Warhol and pop art, also photorealism. He's just listing every stuff from the 70s, basically, at this point. 70s and 80s as popular art. And he's like, well, what does this all have in common? And I'm skipping. And he mentions Burroughs, Thomas Pynchon, Ishmael Reed. You'll notice that, it's still like women are missing. It's like he has not registered yet the feminist critique of the art world, sadly. This text is from 86, I want to say. I should know exactly. 88, it says. But I think it was earlier than that. It was circulated in 85, 86, some of his arguments. Okay, he calls these varieties of postmodernism. The next paragraph. This list would seem to make two things clear at once. First, most of the postmodernism mentioned above emerge as specific reactions against established forms of high modernism. Postmodernism, high modernism. Against this or that dominant high modernism, so on and so forth. Those formerly subversive and embattled styles. And like art is subversion, I would have added there. Now, as I'm skipping all the people he mentions, Wallace Stevens and Joyce and blah, 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 that is all felt at the bottom to be the establishment and the enemy, dead, stifling, canonical. The reified monuments one has to be destroyed to do anything new. So it's also very dialectical in the sense that every generation wants to sort of say, oh, these are actually the things that don't work anymore. Therefore, I need to make this. Oh, these are the things that don't work anymore. I need to make this. This is sort of this dialectical story we're going to map. Okay, that's feature number one of postmodernism. Second feature, he says, is the effacement of key boundaries or separations, most notably the erosion of older distinction between high culture and so-called mass or popular culture. And now he's like, you can have great B Hollywood films or Reader's Digest, or like on Netflix, you can have great films and schlock next to each other, and it doesn't matter. It's all the same thing. High art and low art, commercial art, are increasingly difficult to draw. Again, Andy Warhol being the famous example. This is art for the marketplace. Also high art too. It's art for the museum. I could add that in here. It'll take me forever, but again, that's another period style pastiche. The high-low is no longer relevant, whereas it's still somewhat relevant in modernism. Joyce is high art, but he is pasting low art, like into his work. And so on, but it's still high art. Samuel Beckett is high, right? Except for it's got low comedy in there too. It's like got burlesque. So modernism is already messing with the high-low distinction, but it's still, you're going to see this in the quality theater, right? You're not going to see it in the street or something like that, even though it depicts like street things. Whereas postmodernism is supposedly deconstructing that, although in reality, you're still going to see it in the museum or in the academy. The next paragraph goes on to point out that theory is like postmodern as compared to like philosophy as more traditional, but I'm just going to skip that. Then he goes to the next paragraph, 1759 at the bottom. Now I must say a word about the proper use of this concept. It is not just another word for the description of a particular style. It's not a particular style, it's a periodizing concept, he says, or a period style, whose function it is to correlate the emergence of new formal features in culture with the emergence of a new type of social life and a new economic order. Well, we just did that. Okay? And which is often euphemistically called modernization or post-industrial or consumer society, the society of the media or the spectacle, multinational capitalism. These are all phrases that were sort of the emergent descriptors for this thing called postmodernism. This new moment of capitalism can be dated from the post-war boom in the United States in the late 40s and 50s or France. So whatever. He's trying to figure out when it is, whether it's the 50s or 60s. None of this matters anymore. But the idea that there is a period style is what's sort of Jameson's famous for. And he's going to say that the two period styles are pastiche and schizophrenia. Schizophrenia we don't even get to in this sample, but we get to pastiche. So why is pastiche? And maybe that'll probably Yeah, at least one thing we can talk about. Well, he tells you in the next paragraphs. One of the most significant features or practices in postmodernism is pastiche. They must first explain this term, which people generally tend to confuse with parody. Both pastiche and parody involve the imitation, or better still, the mimicry of other styles, and particularly the mannerisms and stylistic twists of other styles. There it goes. Think of the Faulknerian long sentence, or D.H. Lawrence's characteristic nature imagery. Think of Wallace Stevens' way of using abstractions. So these are all supposed to be like versions of parody. I don't really know why he thinks that is, but anyways, whatever. Parody capitalizes on the uniqueness of these styles and seizes on their idiosyncrasies and eccentricities to produce an imitation which mocks the original. Okay, so he's saying modernism often used parody. And you might say like Joyce is parodying Dickens, or Joyce is parodying Homer. Virginia Woolf is parodying Jane Austen, maybe even, to some extent. The novel of sort of female self-discovery in something like Mrs. Dalloway. These are just random examples I'm picking from like the modernist reaction to the previous generations. Well, okay, but next paragraph says, what would happen if one no longer believed in the existence of normal language or ordinary speech or the linguistic norm? And Orwell might be the example. One could think of it in this way. Perhaps the immense fragmentation and privatization of modern literature, its explosion into a host of distinct private styles and mannerisms, foreshadows deeper and more general tendencies in social life as a whole. Skipping a bit, he says, the emergence of the great modern styles, society has itself begun to fragment in this way, each group coming to speak a curious private language. He calls that also a linguistic island. He calls this stylistic diversity, but to the degree that it's been accelerated, and everyone's got their own island of style. That is the moment at which pastiche appears and parody has become impossible. Pastiche is, like parody, the imitation of peculiar or unique style, wearing a stylistic mask, but it is a neutral practice of such mimicry without parody's ulterior motive, without the satirical impulse. Famously, then he goes on to say, well, pastiche is blank parody, or blank irony, and so on. I don't know, this argument was argued over forever, and I grew up with this argument, and I just remember everyone saying, like, is this true pastiche? Is this blah, blah, blah? Versions of parody, like, well, parody was you can see parody in the Renaissance, and parody and pastiche, we'll go on and on about this. I do like talking about formal qualities, but my question is what is he saying exactly with pastiche, and do you think he's right? Is pastiche the period style here? Why does it show up for him so importantly here? And is he right about that? Did everyone understand what that? Yeah, sorry.
Well, I think he's kind of arguing that there is no longer any originality.
Okay.
Right?
Yes.
So he's arguing that pastiche is the style because there's nothing new to do.
Exactly.
But it's no longer funny. There's no longer any humor to find in it. It's
Yeah.
just you're always reproducing something else.
Yeah. So it's like cutting and pasting from the history of style, but you know that Eliot did that in The Wasteland, and with all these citations. But he did it for great effect to reinvigorate all of culture, and the poem itself. These people do it because they don't believe in that anymore. Utopia failed. The aesthetic failed. So they just patch together because it's just pieces of style out there or something like that for no particular purpose, but other than for the marketplace or whatever. You want a historical novel? Here you go. You want a novel of female self-discovery? Here you go. You want the rom-com? You just throw it all out there. It's essentially Netflix. I think is a great example of total pastiche. Style for anybody, all style, all available. No, what's the period style of the contemporary? All styles are valid. There is no that's and that is what he's saying about pastiche, in a somewhat elevated literary way. But he's using that word pastiche, but that's kind of what it means.
It's like intellectual plastic surgery when beauty doesn't matter anymore. You're just changing things, right? But you never get anywhere.
Yeah. Just change for the sake of changing because that's stimulating or something like that. That would be pastiche. Yeah.
I just have a question. Where does camp fit into all of this? Because I know that I've read camp and pastiche used as distinct terms.
Yeah.
And I can obviously see the difference between camp, but I'm curious if there's
Usually people associate camp with a bit of a queer aesthetic, and pastiche would be anybody can use it. Of course, Andy Warhol is supposed to be iconic example of cutting and pasting everything, and he's very campy and queer. I think when you're doing, if you have a queer camp aesthetic, you're not just doing it for the sake of all art goes, but you're actually trying to do a form of queer expression, a kind of, I would even say queer justice, like queer communal building, and you have a social purpose that is not social, like the blank thing that this is showing us. Netflix doesn't have a social purpose. Whether, I wouldn't call it, camp will just be any style among other styles. Whereas the camp style itself does have something more than just praise of, like parody of style. It's more than just parody of style, although it is just that too. But there's a fine line, I suppose. Because if Warhol is his favorite example, is he really reading Warhol well? Jameson's not a queer theorist. He doesn't understand what the heck. It's his favorite example, and yet he doesn't fully understand what he's talking about.
That's kind of what I was thinking about is like the soup cans is like the great example.
Yeah.
But it's like if you look at the soup cans for long enough, it's not just a neutral like mimicry.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. He has. It's not here sadly, but he has a couple of like visuals that he returns to over and over again. And if you buy the book, you'll see them. The cover of the book is Warhol's shoes, like it's called Diamond Shoes or something like that. And it's basically just a simple Warhol still screen of like women's shoes, I think. But he reads this he reads the shoe in comparison to Van Gogh's shoes that Van Gogh painted, and Heidegger has a famous essay on Van Gogh's shoes, and it's supposed to be showing like the gathering of the earth and the peasantry and so on and so forth. And Warhol's like, yeah, I'm pastiching that. I'm pastiching this great history of shoe art and like Van Gogh. But now it's just throwaway shoes that anyone would wear. Well, actually, the fact that it's women's shoes and there's a kind of like queer, maybe even trans gesture there is being totally missed by Jameson. And it's not just pastiche, it's camp, as you're saying. Yeah.
I just had a question about whether we can't really answer this, but would Jameson read like a character like Vonnegut, like an author like Vonnegut, as pastiche? Like it fits in the time period.
Yeah, everyone gets thrown into this period
it
style.
blurs high-low,
Yeah.
and he also loves to play with different genre types.
Yeah, exactly.
There's tons of
Sci-fi, yeah.
but at the same time, I feel like that reading fails to reconcile with Vonnegut's satirical impulse. Like he's saying that pastiche lacks that ulterior motive.
Yeah.
But I would maybe problematize that.
Well, but Vonnegut is also satirizing the power of the novel all the time, and in his characters too, for aesthetic pleasure, but also because he no longer is a martyr. He's no longer Joyce, who thinks that these people are going to do like such radical work in the world and save Ireland and so on. I think he would feel like that's a canonical example of the postmodern.
Yeah.
I mean, I absolutely remember these conversations in the 90s. Where
It just from all the descriptions, it feels like it fits perfectly.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I wonder if that definition is succinct enough. Like I feel like it might.
Yeah.
Like it feels a bit reductive to me.
Well, that's one of the problems with Jameson is that even if he's not doing reductive historicism, he's doing reductive periodization.
Yeah.
And to throw everyone in here and to miss camp and queer theory, that's pretty damn reductive. It's like a real failure of the method that he couldn't pick that up, and he still never did. He died, not writing on queer theory, strangely enough. And he was brilliant at other things. He was really good on sci-fi, for example. He was really good on contemporary novels, really good on film. I mean, he's prolific. Really good on Hegel, on realism, on Marx, on Benjamin, so on and so forth. He had these brilliant readings, but he also missed so much of the landscape of literature. Famously, when this book out, he did not have, all these authors are basically Anglo authors, what happened to the rest of the world? Is kind of like a imperialistic vision, or maybe even racist, you might say, to the degree that he has no insight into anything beyond that world. It's very problematic. But he would throw that back and say, oh, it's all pastiche too. It's world pastiche. You pick a little bit, you pick an author here, you pick an author here, and then they're all available in the airport novel section. I just want to reiterate though, is this true to you? Because again, it's pastiche because style has lost its mission. In realism, realist style was to make the communist revolution. In modernism, modernist style was to make aesthetic utopias, or maybe national utopias, whatever, but it had a utopian drive. We have pastiche now because because like, I said, my syllabus, you pick and choose. You pick and choose. Doesn't matter if you're picking Shakespeare or Margaret Atwood or novels from Egypt. Good, because you're in the marketplace of literature, and that's all. Everyone has their choices, and that's called pastiche.
I think, I just read a lot of queer theory, so I think about like Jose Munoz and like Cruising Utopia, and also one of my favorite discussions by Billy Ray Belcourt is the idea of like citational joy, and the idea that the true utopia is not in the individual act of telling, it's in the citational references to other things, and the movement between meaning and all that stuff, and it's I don't know that where that fits in with pastiche. To me, it doesn't feel right to call that like a pastiche, because it feels really intentional. Yeah, it feels like, because you could go the other route of the death that you find in like queer experiences, like the idol and stuff, but you intentionally choose to make this patchwork of your experience, to take from others,
and to turn it into some intersubjective, maybe collective,
and
radical.
Pastiche feels like the wrong word for that, but there is a utopia there.
I absolutely agree with it. I think basically, and Jameson would agree with you too, by the way. He, again, as a Marxist, and he would be fine with like queer radicalism too. He would just keep saying that, like, this is the period style, but everyone's writing against it too. It's not that they're just all falling into it. So Worrell's pushing against it too. As much as he's using pastiche, he's also trying to rebel against it because he recognizes it as the period style. And Billy Ray Belcourt is going to use like cutting and pasting, not because he thinks that social media is the period style, yes, but so that he can push against it, like, and change it. And Jameson is pro that because as a Marxist, he was like, what happened to our utopian impulses? Where did they go? We have to theorize that and see it in the literature, in the aesthetic. It never goes away. And I totally agree with it, to the degree that, like, I 100% believe in that. I think I need to describe it more and more to the students because I forget all the time. But like, it is the thing that gets us out of these, like, I want to think of stuck styles, but also we were talking about how you de-alienate yourself and how to get out of the commodity form. That's it. It's the utopian impulse. It's like, to the degree that we remain tied to that, and it's not about the individual utopia. It's the individual connected to the social. Then we have a method, basically. We have a purpose now, and we have a way of reading literature to understand it, to map it, cognitively map it, but also to find its utopian kernel. And Jameson does this very well. So we actually haven't seen it yet in any example. Sadly, like, the best example he's going to give you is the Bonaventure Hotel, or Chinatown, or even he has a little blurb about Star Wars, and he's like, Star Wars as nostalgia. Why? It's like, it's a future, isn't it? But it's actually he says it's replaying all this sort of 1930s like serial fan like work and so on. But he's totally right about that. But he probably should have pushed a little bit on the, like, Star Wars also has a utopian kernel, which is like, we're going to save everybody, or like not just defeat like the dark side, but also through the collectivity of this movie, we are going to refuse fascism. I don't know, whatever it is. You name it, or something like that. But he is smart. That's why people love him too. It's not that he just cognitively maps. He refuses to give up on, again, what he will call the Marxist project, but maybe we're just better off calling the utopian kernel of what we all do. And that's why, like, Jose Munoz wrote that book, Cruising Utopia, and saying that queer theory has a utopian kernel too. Like, it can't not have it. So and again, I think when these arguments came out, everyone wanted to say, you know, this doesn't feel satisfactory. Like, we're not going to just accept postmodernism as is. This is not particularly inviting. Is it? None of this looks very happy, does it? Like, I don't want to just sit with this. So why can't we get something else out of it? What is that next thing? Like that, but that just requires, again, more literature, more theory, more art. It gave us a purpose too, in a way. But then again, this argument has been around for 40 years, and are we back in the pastiche mode? That's kind of what I'm still asking, to be honest, because I see it in my syllabus, I see it in the way we teach, I see it in just that you choose your period and that's it. So are we stuck in pastiche?
I would push back a little bit against even the idea of like this blank, this kind of blank thing that you're, making fun of and you're putting meaning back into. It's like women's voices, it's queer people's voices, it's trans people's voices, it's racialized voices. Just the people who, like, they're less legible because white men don't want to read them, right? Yeah. So that...
And it is doing that social work that we thought that, social realism was sort of doing in the 1900s, but now queer texts or indigenous texts are doing in the 21st century. So it never really went away; it just took different shapes, and that's a good thing, right? I mean, and we haven't lost that like utopian drive in the English department.
We lost someone's utopia, though.
Yeah.
That's what I would say.
Yeah, that whether Picasso's or something like that. That said, though, I still wonder. I mean, I still think at the same time, why haven't those movements? I mean, are they running into their own problems of like getting stuck in their period styles? And is it and as readers, like I just read Everybody's Shirks. Sorry to throw that back at you. And I think you're all brilliant, but I also worry about everyone getting stuck in their period styles, like saying, I do this, and here's what I'm looking for, it's this. And it's like, well, why? And I want you to do that. That's important. That's called specialization, and that you can't cover everything. But I also want to push a little bit on that and say, well, how does that lead to anything beyond that? It's because I think we're always relying on essentially historicist context, and we do that over and over again. And whether we do it in queer theory, whether you do it in trans studies, whether you do it in indigenous studies, it's all this mapping of text to context. And to if we keep doing that over and over again, that's become our period style. Again, I wouldn't exactly call it historicism anymore. I would just call it, again, this context thing that we all do. That indigenous literature maps indigenous values. Trans literature matches trans values. And to me, I think that is important. There's no doubt. But I also want to say, well, how do we... Yes, that's, again, like I'm saying, it's a period style, and that's also not the only thing we should be doing. We should still be able to... I would like to see people try and theorize, how does indigenousness change the story of what a novel is? That still needs to be written. How does it change, how does Billy Ray Belcourt change what a poem, the poem or the lyric means anymore? Because even poetry is in the same, story of running into postmodernism and post-postmodernism and so on. People are tired of that. One of my favorite poets is Jordan Abel, and I think he really actually is engaged in that. He's like, I'm tired of that story, that poetry always telling of itself. But I'll use some of those tools, like mimesis, and to sort of retell indigenous stories, but also to challenge that. Where does the history of poetry and the history of indigeneity meet, and in smart ways? And so the work is being done; it's out there. I'm not, but I think as critics, we need to push ourselves to make a bit bigger claims on what you think. Again, what Jameson would say is what is the content of your form? So you're reading a poem or you're reading an indigenous novel. Well, how does that form of the novel itself need to be theorized, if you will, or periodized, or historicized, or whatever you want to call it? Tell us a little bit about form as much as content. Content will always be indexical. Okay, the characters are doing this because they have these values, but the form, I think, is where we kind of push ourselves a little bit better, and have bigger conversations about all these maps that we're drawing. And I'd like to see a little bit more of that in some of these argument. That's my suggestion. You can take it or leave it. It's up to you. Okay, we have like a mere 10 minutes for 2 more takes. Haha. So we're not really gonna like. And then if you wanted, by the way, there's this famous reading of the Bonaventure Hotel and Frederick Jameson. You should Google it and see what he's actually talking about. But it's basically every building. So in LA there was this just giant glass hotel, and famously says it's got no really designated entrance. Before you had a modernist building with like a big entrance and like it says, "Come inside." Now every building, as you know, you're like, where does he go? What does this look like? It's just formless. Is it pushing away from the city? Is it integrated in the city? It doesn't care anymore about the city. These buildings map like lit capitalism. And this university loves to build those kinds of buildings to some extent. Or every city, the condo is the perfect period style of contemporary architecture, where it hits all these notes. And so, anyways, Jameson's so clever. He's so good at doing that stuff, and I think it is a good thing. So keep that in mind as you're. Okay, Peter Salibras, total different worldview. Like it's almost, but yet Peter Salibras is very much in the Jamesonian tradition. You may not think that because we're talking about Shakespeare and the word individual, and we're doing textual scholarship, print culture. Like we're so far away from this, aren't we? Well, actually, he's doing the very similar things, but with a little bit savvier tools, to be honest. So, especially if you're a Renaissance scholar, for example. So, Salibras is a great Renaissance scholar. He was at the university that I went to, so I took classes with him. Wonderful. This is a wonderful essay. It just simply is. And whether you like Shakespeare or not, you get a lot out of it. And his first point, as he opens, he says, ideology interpolates us as subjects. That's from Althusser. What is a subject? He gives you some definitions of that. But the majority of this essay is about actually why do we all talk about everyone as individuals? When did this shift from subject to individual happen? And he says at the bottom of this first paragraph, Althusser's synchronic formula masks a curious diachronic reversal. All right, it would be more exact to say that within a capitalist mode of production, ideology interpolated not the individual as subject, but the subject as individual. For the individual is not the simple given of bourgeois social formations. Contrary, he's made, essentially historically made. And the subject precedes the individual. And the reason he's saying that is because like feudalism and monarchy culture is subjects. King and the subjects. And that's the edge of Shakespeare and all his kings. And then after that, Shakespeare creates sort of modernity, and you have the English Revolution in the 1640s, and everyone's now an individual. You went from subjects to individuals. And even though we theorize, like the word theorizing the subject was so big in like the 80s and 90s, and subjectivity, we might have been better off calling it that individuality, because that's really what it was. It was the rise of the bourgeois individual. And yet he goes on to say, well, this is Salibras' key. I'm giving you like the quick and dirty, but Salibras, and I haven't taken his class, he would always say like, always find out the history of your words. He would have an assignment where he would say, pick a word. I still do this with my students. Like I'm teaching Whitman sometimes, I'll say, pick one word in Whitman. Go to the OED. So this is word for word stolen from, or technique stolen from Peter Salibras. Go to the Oxford English Dictionary. Find out who first used that word. What was some of the origins and the history of the usage of that word. It will tell you so much about what that word is doing in Walt Whitman. For example, Whitman's, I sing myself and celebrate myself. That word celebrate is one of the best ones to look up, because if you just look up self, it'll be boring, to be honest. And I've had students look up like any old number. It really matters which word you're choosing. If you chose individual, you're going to hit the gold mine. If you chose celebrate, it's interesting because celebrate in 1830s and 40s doesn't mean have a party. It can also, it means more like, I've already forgotten the right? Technically, I'm going to make it up to some extent if I remember right. But I think it means things like, I think it had a religious connotation of like, discovery of the spirit. To that extent, so that's what I'm going to argue for now. There's also maybe a queer like thing of like embedded in the history of the English language, what the word celebrate might. It does get you really close to the word celibate, but that's not really etymologically true, but culturally it might be. Anyways, when he says I celebrate myself, it really is his spiritual becoming rather than just saying like, hey, I'm a great guy. And because everyone reads that poem as like, oh, you're full of yourself and your ego, Walt Whitman. Well, maybe when he's saying celebrate, he's actually saying, look, I discovered, by the way, myself is embedded in the spiritual cosmos of everything. It's the opposite of the ego. But as he goes on and writes it, he becomes more and more, it's always the tension between the individual and the cosmic whole in Whitman and so on. But that's the emergence of that. And you can identify it with the word celebrate. Well, you could do the word individual. And you could do Shakespeare. But not only that, the question is isn't Shakespeare a writer of great individual characters? Hamlet, or Coriolanus, or whatever, King Lear. And he goes on to show you that Shakespeare never used the word individual, ever. Okay? Except for maybe in one instance. But it's not clear who wrote it. Okay? It's a collaboration with Fletcher and Shakespeare. And the Noble Kinsman. And then Shakespeare famously, if you know anything about Renaissance, if you like your Shakespeare, it's like, what is a play? Isn't it a collaborative work? Who plays what role? Why were they not printed in Shakespeare's time? Why was he not valued as the author? Indeed, he wasn't. What was an author in Shakespeare's time? It's only like really after he's, it's somewhat of a mystery even still, to what degree he was seen as the author rather than the play company itself, or the players and the play company. Also, not all, but many of his works are retellings of stories already existing. So why would he call himself the author? You didn't do that. You were a reteller of things. And so on. But also, to the degree that the printer does print the first folio in 1624, I want to say, it's like the rise of copyright and printer, and property. Everything we call like the bourgeois individual system, which is this word individual. Okay, but then to add even more complications, I'm obviously doing this quick and dirty here, but the word individual may actually mean not individual. The history of the word individual may not be the word, it may be the opposite of what it means. So it's a dialectical word to begin with. And this is on this page 594, so obviously I'm not showing you this very well, step by step. But if you use the OED, you'll see that the earliest version is 1425, the next version is 1597, and then there's an explosion around like 1614 to 1630. That's the modernization of what we would say. But before that, the very few iterations suggest the Trinity, which is not individual. You can't divide it. It's all into one. That's what means individual, not capable of being divided. Indivisible. So individual means the opposite. Something that is sort of collective, if you will, in its etymological invention. And then through Shakespeare, or not exactly through Shakespeare, but through that moment of entering into the Renaissance and going out of it, it turns into this modern term. But once again, Shakespeare doesn't use it, or if he does use it once, it's also kind of tied up with sexuality. I don't even have time to get into it, but there's something there. If you're really curious, like it goes all the way back to Plato. Plato thought that if you read the Symposium, sexuality happened because humans used to be tied together, and the gods split them, and that created sort of that's referenced in that it's a poem, the Noble Kinsman, which is referring to these Greek characters, which is referring to basically Plato's Symposium and the theory of love and sexuality there, which is, by the way, a theory of androgyny. And in the Symposium, you have same-sex love is totally fine. And he says, like, well, when it got cut, some people were actually, there was female. They were cut and they became, female love. And it's usually translated as lesbian. And then men were cut, and it's just same-sex male love. And so, or men and women are cut. So Plato is fine with homosexuality, as you would pretty much expect in Greek culture. And it's all this theory that love is finding your other half, your individual, if you will, that reunites you. And that's in the play, the Shakespeare play. But we don't have to theorize the gender, but there's a sort of trans theory and all this that Cyrus doesn't go into that much. But his main point is to show that if you will, like the period style of the emergence of the bourgeois individual through the 1640s to 1740s into the novel is not what Shakespeare is doing. Shakespeare worked in a culture of collectivity, of distributed authorship or no authorship, and of collaboration. And he goes on to say, I'm not trying to idealize the collaboration. Like, yes, like printers, there was a hierarchy in the printers community. There was a hierarchy in the acting community. There was a hierarchy in who Shakespeare is in the court, and so on. It's not to say that collectivity equals no hierarchy. There were, but his point is that it was intersubjective, collective. This is a Marxist argument. Look at all the collectivity going on in Shakespeare's time. That all got weeded out when Shakespeare became the individual genius, and Hamlet became the icon of the great character. But if you really were Shakespearean, if you really were Hamletian, you would see that it was never that bad. It was always these collaborative, constructive, multiple authored things, and so on. So he's using historicism, the OED, individual words, print history, to make historicist argument, Jamesonian style, to show you the shift between from the subject to the individual, i.e. feudalism to capitalism, and the social problems that, not to say that, or Shakespeare is really not feudal, I don't know what you want to call them, Renaissance sociality to bourgeois sociality. And not to say that this was a fall, that it sucked to become individuals, but just that these were cultural shifts that happened, and you have to understand the stylistic effects as well as, let's say, the political effects of all this. He does deep down believe that we are way too individual, and that at least we might read Shakespeare again to recognize that we don't have to be so bourgeois individual again, this is me narrating this entire essay with no more time. But if you reread these essays, you'll see exactly what I just described. And I would encourage you to do that. It's such an eloquent, beautiful essay. It's kind of like what I aspire to do, to use my historicist tools to show something bigger than just Shakespeare doesn't use the word individual. Because he really did make the case that there's a lot going on there. Aesthetically, politically, you could say sexually, queer-wise, and so on. So I used it as a model. We didn't get really the deepest Chakrabarty. It's fine, I might revisit it. It's kind of got an eco argument in there too. And then we have cultural studies next week, which is sort of a carrying on of some of these arguments as well.